Okay, hello everyone. I'm Danny Sriskandarajah. I'm Secretary General of CIVICUS. Thank you very much for joining our webinar on this. For those of you who are new to this format, I hope it's working okay and that you can hear me well. If you have any questions or technical issues, please drop a text question into the group chat box or email one of my colleagues, Matt or Sarah, directly if you're having any difficulties. This is an attempt to bring this year's report to life through an interactive discussion with a few of our authors and also many of our members and partners so that we can have a little bit of a discussion about this year's report. As always, we've tried to do two things in our State of Civil Society report. One is to look back at the year that was for civil society, look at some of those trends and challenges and opportunities facing civil society across the world. And then we've done a deep dive into a theme. And this year's theme, as I'm sure you'll know, was on exclusion, looking at the work that civil society is doing to address exclusion and marginalization, the work that civil society is doing to promote inclusion at a time when so much of the economic drivers around the world are promoting and inequality. And of course, a lot of our focus this year has always also been on looking within civil society to look at our own practice to see if we're doing as much as we should be doing internally to promote inclusion and good practice. So there's been, as always, a huge amount of work put into this report and lots of really interesting material. You'll see an executive summary. For those of you who are pressed for time on our website, you'll see a year in review that looks at events around the world over the last year. You'll see a synthesis report that looks at the theme and tries to synthesize the various contributions. And of course, perhaps most importantly, you'll see 33 guest contributions from members and partners from all over the world, from a variety of backgrounds, who've contributed their views and analysis and recommendations on a particular aspect of the exclusion or inclusion agenda. It's really important for us that the State of Civil Society report for us that he, as a way of presenting a civil society view of the world, but also to speak amongst ourselves. So if you haven't had time, I would really recommend ambling through the State of Civil Society report website and having a look at the amazing material that's on offer there. What we wanted to do today is give you a brief overview of some of the key issues. We're not going to try to cover all of it, but we're trying to give you a glimpse of what's in this year's report. And we're going to have, I hope, 4 presentations in a few minutes. We're going to begin with my colleague Mandeep Tiwana, who's our Head of Policy and Research at CIVICUS, and who's been responsible not just for this year's SOX report, for all of the ones in recent years as well. And Mandeep is going to give us an overview of some of the key themes and lessons from this year's report. We're then going to be joined by 3 of our contributors, 3 of those 33 contributors. Marie Becher is from Peace Brigades International, and to us about some of the trends relating to threats and attacks on indigenous rights and indigenous peoples around the world. And then we hope to be joined by Kene Esom from the African Men for Sexual Health and Rights. And he's going to be talking about trends and threats facing the LGBTI community. And then thirdly, we'll be joined by Joanna Maycock from the European Women's Lobby, who will be talking about equality, about patriarchy as a key driver of exclusion, and some recommendations that she makes in her essay for civil society. So we'll have very briefly Kene and Joanna in that order, and then we'll open up for questions and discussion with the audience. I've already been asked one question about why is this report useful for civil society? Well, I hope there's lots of good information, analysis, comparative analysis about the conditions for civil society in our report. But I hope these 4 contributions will give you some good reasons why we think this is a report worth reading and for civil society colleagues all around the world. So the proof is going to be in the eating. So here we are. I'll hand over to Mandeep for a general overview.
Thanks, Danny. I suppose before I speak about the report, maybe it's good to emphasize that CIVICUS is a global alliance is committed to the celebration of civil society in all its diversity. So when we look at the state of civil society, we look at social movements, we look at community-based organizations, we look at NGOs, we look at professional associations, we look at individual activists, and all the wonderful and innovative things they're doing around the world to challenge exclusion. We are also very grateful to our membership, which spans some 170 countries, and all of the people who inputted report in direct and indirect ways. A little bit about the report itself. The report is our annual checkup, our annual stock taking of the state and the health of civil society, the conditions civil society works in. And at the heart of it, as you mentioned, are 33 essays by some of the leading activists and practitioners across the world. And when we were looking at the theme of exclusion in civil society, one of the things we looked at is, what is a test of a just society? And a test of a just society, the prism that we looked at was, that is a society where there's equality of opportunity, particularly for disadvantaged groups, where minorities are protected, their rights are respected, and where people have access to decision making as well as services, irrespective of where they stand within the social milieu. And on this basis, many of our societies are failing. And it's even more stark by the recent Brexit vote and also the rise of right-wing politics in many established democracies. So the theme has gained renewed urgency for this. One of our key conclusions, far too many people are being denied access to decision making and services. They're being excluded from public life on the basis of their gender, their sexual identity, their ethnicity, their caste, their mental health and HIV status, where they live, their refugee status, their migration status, their income, and much more. Take, for example, the economic inequality. We live in a time when there's been unprecedented advances in science and technology and wealth creation, yet 10% of humanity, that is some 700 million people, live on less than $2 a year, a day. And now juxtapose this with Oxfam's recent report, where just 62 people own as much wealth as half of humanity. Equally, in far too many places around the world, women don't have the right to equal pay for equal work. They're being denied that right. They don't have equal rights in law on inheritance or on succession or on ownership of property in several parts of the world, which is quite shocking in the 21st century. But civil society is challenging exclusion, and as several of our essays show, whether it's supporting the rights of transgender communities in Pakistan, in northwest Pakistan, particularly where there's a toxic mix of state authoritarianism and fundamentalist and fundamentalism happening there. But civil society has also risen to the occasion to assist refugees in Europe when states failed, when governments failed, when societies were sometimes unwelcoming. Civil society organizations, civil society activists stepped in and filled the gap. In Africa, and Kene is going to probably speak a little more about this, where there is institutional discrimination against LGBTI communities, civil society has helped creating a movement on LGBTI rights across the continent. And as a testament to some of their efforts, there is now a special rapporteur on freedom, on sexual orientation and gender identity, which will help address some of these issues. On the global stage, the big story for civil society, of course, was to make sure that the Sustainable Development Goals were far more inclusive and rights respecting than the Millennium Development Goals. There's a goal particularly targeted to inequality within and between states. And also inclusion is a cross-cutting theme throughout the report. Some of the major events of last year, for example, were demonstrated that civil society helped and fill in the gap. For example, in Nepal, when the state was slow to react, civil society organizations actually came and filled the gap. In Syria and Yemen, where the Geneva Conventions have been blatantly violated by all sides of the conflict, civil society organizations are providing relief and succor to communities on the ground. But despite all of this, all of the benefits that civil society has shown, our analysis also shows that civil society freedoms are under severe attack. In fact, in 109 countries across the world, many of them established democracies, the core civil society freedoms of expression, of association, and peaceful assembly were substantially restricted. And to thwart civil society efforts, governments are using many different kinds of rhetoric, the rhetoric of counterterrorism, the rhetoric of national values, the rhetoric of cultural values, the rhetoric of economic development to put unjustified limitations on free speech, association, and assembly. And within this, civil society is facing further challenges, particularly those civil society that are working for the rights of excluded groups or those that belong to excluded groups. And I know that Marie is going to speak a little more on this issue, but in Latin America and in many parts of Southeast Asia, indigenous communities that have been trying to protect valuable natural resources from the activities of extractive industries and agribusinesses have been attacked in many different parts of the world. And of course, Joanna will also be able to probably speak to this, is in countries like Pakistan and in many parts in the Middle East, women human rights defenders have come under severe attack when they have worked for women's rights or advocated for greater participation of women in public life. We also have a problem which is a serious problem in Bangladesh, where bloggers who've been supporting the rights of religious minorities have been killed in the most brutal of ways, brought to us in its reality by the recent terrorist attack there. But despite all of these these setbacks, temporary setbacks, I would say, civil society is refusing to accept a narrative of disempowerment. Organizations and activists are fighting back. They're fighting back against the hate and divisiveness that is being preached by some politicians and by terrorist groups. In fact, Tunisia is a testament to the commitment and sustained engagement of civil society to build peace and democracy in that country and to resist a slide into repression and extremism. The Tunisian National Quartet, which comprised of a human rights organization, a lawyers group, a labor union, and a trade confederation, was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize in recognition of its services. But in addition to this, there are also large-scale mobilizations that happened over the course of last year. For example, in Guatemala, Guatemala is a country which is known for corruption in high places, and the tipping point was when the president's office was linked to corruption scandals and lowering of customs duties, which directly impacted people belonging to economically weaker sections of society in hospitals who needed dialysis treatment. And there were large-scale protests led by civil society, both organized and unorganized, which led to the president having to resign and for criminal charges, including fraud, to be instituted against the president. In South Korea, there were large-scale mobilizations against the pro-business policies of the government, which has led to a weakening of employment rights, and which will also impact small farmers in many harmful ways. Their civic groups and labor groups and the general public came together in large numbers to mobilize against policies that were pro-elitist. In South Africa, we've seen where there was an arbitrary rise in student fees, which would negatively impact on students belonging to economically weaker sections of society. There was a large-scale mobilizations in the United States, which is facing an epidemic of black people being killed by the police in questionable circumstances. The Black Lives Matter hashtag is turned into a powerful movement, which is documenting instances of police violence against black individuals. So civil society is fighting back, and civil society is challenging many of these negative narratives. Overall, I would say, our reading from the report is that civil society really needs public support, and we really need to win the battle for hearts and minds amongst global publics. There's lots of new innovations that are happening at the international level. Senior leaders are speaking a lot through resolutions, and there's been resolutions adopted by states, but much of this is not percolating down at the national level, and we really need to work harder to impress upon global publics about the value of an empowered and able civil society. So I just want to leave you with one final thought, is that when civil society flourishes, society gains from that fact. And this is the greatest argument that we can make against those who try to restrict our rights in this current environment where economic inequality, religious fundamentalism, political extremism, and state authoritarianism are all conspiring together to restrict civil society rights. Thank you.
Very much, Mandeep. I hope that that was reasonably clear to understand to most people. I hear that Mandeep's audio was breaking. Drop a message in the chat box if you're having trouble, and we'll see what we can do. I'm now going to ask our colleague Marie Becher from Peace Brigades International to talk about her contribution to this year's report. Thank you.
So I may appear as delaying, but I'll be the one speaking.
Marie, are you
Hello?
there? Hello? Yes, over to you, Marie. Yes.
Sorry. So you can hear me now, and can you see the presentation on my screen?
We can hear you, and I think we should be able to see your presentation, yes.
Can you see it now? Hello?
I'm being told that the presentation may not be working, so perhaps you could just talk us through it, please. Oh, now it's on. Okay, it's on.
And can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you very clearly.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sorry. Sorry, the technologies is always a challenge. So hello, everyone, and thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to speak very briefly on the issue of my guest contribution, threats and attacks on indigenous peoples' rights activists. About 2 weeks ago, our colleagues from Global Witness published their annual report in 2015. They environmental defenders of 185 documented cases of activists defending the land, forests, and rivers against active industries. % of these victims. We also know that the true numbers must be much higher. This is really an alarming increase by about more than 50% in comparison to the year before. Brazil, and then the Philippines, followed by Colombia, Peru, Nicaragua, and Democratic Republic of Congo. We know and we have documented that aggressors are in many cases acting as a network of local, national, and transnational corporations, private security companies, and members of old or new elites who are pursuing economic benefits. So indigenous human rights defenders are attacked because they are living and using lands that powerful actors have an interest in. I briefly want to summarize what are the aggressions that they face, apart from killings and threats and attacks. they also have to deal a lot with criminalization and stigmatization. And this is especially difficult for them because here you have new actors attacking them, but using just for activists from the majority population to counteract criminalization, because they have a very limited access to the justice system anyway. And then criminalization often goes hand in hand with stigmatization, and indigenous activists are called in the public media to be, and so the whole this strategy of stigmatization attacks the cohesion. That is very important. I wanted to briefly mention, as I their male colleagues face gender-based attacks and challenges, and have to struggle a lot with a lack of recognition of their role and work within their own collectives at times, but then also within the wider and from public and political stakeholders, of course. And then unity, these powerful actors that attack indigenous human rights defenders act too often into impunity, which gives signal to anyone who wants to commit offenses against them, that they basically can act without, having to be afraid of any consequences for their activities. I want to finalize, to keep it short, with the 3 recommendations I made in the guest contribution, of course drawing upon our experience and the experience of colleagues. One is that we recommend civil society on the local, national and international level to cooperate to strengthen indigenous activists' capacities to document occur. And can you still hear me? Okay, sorry. And then we need a good documentation of the impunity, as mentioned before, and of the strategies that have been helpful and effective in changing the relates to indigenous that they play in their communities and work towards their protection, defining with them strategies of integrated security and also for external actors. It's very, very important we are engaging to understand security on rooms, and that security is, going physical security, but takes into account the political context, gender, and psychosocial dimensions of threats and attacks. And then the third recommendation is that we all work together to call upon governments that policies and mechanisms that directly relate to the protection of evolving around business and human rights, because it is so important, indigenous activists, but you can also, of course, refer to others, so that all these policies and also respond adequately to the often collective nature, both of activism and risk for indigenous communities. Because very often we see that our strategies and that respond, but then especially in the case of indigenous activists, we need to think of the collective. So I would leave it and debate and hand over to the next colleague. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Marie. That was fabulous. We're now joined by Kene Esom from African Men for Sexual Health and Rights, who's joining us by phone, but I hope that he'll be able to hear us and tell us a bit more about his contribution to this year's State of Civil Society report. Over to you, Kene.
Hi, good day, everyone. Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay, lovely. So my contribution focused on challenging the single narrative around human rights, sexual orientation, and gender identity in Africa. And within the context of a civil society report, or the State of Civil Society report, and with realities around shrinking spaces, increasing clampdown on civil society, which are as much a reality in Africa and other parts of the world, I thought to focus this piece on the danger of a single narrative, because inadvertently what we've identified as a single narrative of LGBT persons in Africa in its own way contributes to the shrinking space that organizations working on sexual orientation and gender identity in Africa have experienced. And so when I speak of a single narrative, what is it I'm talking about? We found that without doubt, of course, in Africa and across a number of African countries, LGBT persons face a lot of challenges, human rights abuses, rights violations sponsored by state or condoned in some way by state or state agencies. We have violations inspired by, incited by religious leaders. So these are realities that we see in our continent, but these are not realities that are exclusive to Africa. However, the challenge we find is that this seems to be the only narrative, this narrative of the African LGBT person who is this victim, who is powerless, who is in this passive state of constant oppression, constant repression, constant rights violation, who has no agency of sorts and is in no way being reactive in this environment or being proactive. And we felt as organizations, as communities of LGBT persons on the continent, that this narrative has not so much served our communities as they have served some of the external, sometimes well-meaning partners who need this narrative to, maybe force people to focus on some of these issues. So in my piece, I shared a number of areas where LGBT persons in Africa are demonstrating resilience, showing agency around their faith, around their engagement with stakeholders, with policymakers. I highlighted the fact that on this continent now we have at the very least 3 continental Pan-African organizations with membership almost across every continent. And I'm talking about organizational memberships community-based organizations who within their communities are either providing services, sometimes health-related services, paralegal services, psychosocial services for LGBT communities, who are doing advocacy and engaging with policymakers, with lawmakers, with other stakeholders within their agencies, both at community level, in national spaces, and regional spaces. And it is important to show that despite how repressive the environment in these countries are, that there is a new sense of organizing, that there is more strategic thinking about what advocacy means for us as Africans in Africa from a regional, continental perspective, but also in countries. We see this kinds of collective organizing of LGBT organizations and communities to ask very strategically how to bring change within their communities. So this is one of the positive developments that I highlighted in my piece. The other was also to mention the fact that across the continent, we see increasing engagement with the judiciary. Over and over again, we've seen LGBT groups go to court either to challenge laws that make it difficult for them to register as community-based organizations or as NGOs, or to freely gather or assemble, or to freely express their opinions with their peers. And we've seen that in a variety of cases, the courts have stood with the community to affirm their rights to freedom of expression, to freedom of association, their rights to freedom from arbitrary arrest. And this increasing use of litigation, whether strategically, whether in an everyday manner, to challenge human rights violations, is also something that's picking up. And it's beautiful, you know, I mean, I think the beauty of the story and the experience is that oftentimes these cases are being initiated by everyday people with the most limited of resources, oftentimes paralegals who are not full-fledged lawyers, who are not trial lawyers, but who have found ways to harness the resources around our communities and be able to challenge injustice. We've seen developments leading out to this opening up of spaces, however small, for community engagement, for expression across the continent. We also see increasing engagement with faith leaders. In a continent and across countries where the issue of faith and sexuality almost is taboo public discourse. Increasingly, we're building together with our communities networks of religious leaders who are interested in understanding more about issues of sexual orientation and gender identity, and how some of their speeches, their messages on the platforms they occupy inadvertently affect communities. And I think the point to make here in closing is that we need to build greater solidarity. I think part of the challenge we found is that oftentimes even human rights-based organizations, civil society organizations working on other social justice causes, are often the ones that are most resistant to the human rights or advancing the rights of LGBT persons. And as I look at this report and hear the varied experiences from across the world of the commonalities we face, irrespective of the issues we work on, shrinking spaces, increased government clampdown, attacks on sources of funding and resource, arbitrary arrest and detention, and all of these things, I think now more than ever, we need to build more cross-team, cross-movement solidarities. We need to find ways to unite as civil society against the forces that militate against open societies and issues of social justice. So I'll leave it at that at this point.
Thank you very much, Kene, especially for talking a little bit about the optimistic and positive signs that you're seeing around some of the opportunities to win hearts and minds. So I'm going to hand over to our final presenter, Joanna Maycock, who's Secretary General of the European Women's Lobby and another one of our guest contributors this year. Joanna, over to you. We seem to be having some technical issues. Apologies for that. While we wait for Joanna. Oh, here we go. We can see you, Joanna, but we can't hear you yet. Not yet. Can you? Have you got a mute button on the top of your screen that you can? No. It says unmute. I think she's saying. Now you've muted her. There you go. Joanna, do you want to try again, please? Oh. Sorry, everybody. It's the inevitable technical glitch. We can see you wonderfully, but not hear you. Our system says that you're unmuted. Okay.
And then we'll try to get her to join again.
Maybe you'd have to just rejoin, please, Joanna, and then see if we can make this work this time. Sorry, while we wait for Joanna to do that, if anyone would like to kick off the conversation with a comment or a question. I know we've got a few questions already lined up, but before we go to those, is there anyone who'd like to jump in with a comment or a question? Joanna, are you back?
Yep.
We can hear you clearly now. Wonderful.
Okay.
Sorry, okay. Over to you, Joanna. Thank you.
Great. Thank you very much. Sorry about that for the delay. So I'm really pleased to have the chance to just share some of the highlights from my contribution to this year's report. And I think it leads on very nicely from what the previous speaker was saying about the need for civil society to think about the way it understands power and privilege itself. I called my essay "Breaking the Glass Pyramid," and I actually took that expression from CIVICUS, who produced a kind of newsletter a few years back, looking at the dearth, actually, of women in leadership within civil society. And that was about 3 years ago. And at the time, I was working at ActionAid International. And I wasn't so surprised, but I was a bit depressed that what seemed to be being said in that newsletter at the time was that really civil society reflected the wider society when it comes to the lack of women in leadership positions. And it's an area I've been very interested in and pursuing ever since. So when I wrote this essay, this article, it was actually back in March. And when I reread it last week, I just thought it seemed to be almost prophetic, actually. We look at the kind of mess being created by the male establishment leadership, particularly in the UK, but you can say the same elsewhere. Not just the mess that's being created, but actually the kind of retreat from the mess that's being created. And if we look at Europe, if we look at power in Europe, statistics on women in power are dismal. It's like less than 30% of women are members of parliament, more than 80% of government ministers are men. We look at judiciary, police, media, it's the same pretty much everywhere. At the European Women's Lobby, we unite women's organisations across Europe to fight for a feminist Europe. And for us, that means gender equality is a prerequisite to achieving the well-being of all people and planet. And for us, as part of that agenda, which is a very broad agenda, we campaign for women to be at the heart of decision-making in all institutions, so in politics, in government, in business, and in civil society. It's not just about having more women, although that does matter. It's also about having women transforming the nature of the systems of decision-making to ensure that they are more inclusive, more diverse, and more effective. Neither is it, and often criticism we get back is that this is somehow promoting women at the expense of more qualified men, who usually are white and middle class as well. It's about reconsidering, actually, the kind of leadership skills and attributes, the kind of institutions and structures that are needed for transformative leadership in the 21st century. For us, it's absolutely essential to promote a diverse, intersectional leadership, privilege based on sex, race, ability, sexual orientation, identity, age. It's not only about women. Women are also represented in all those other groups. So we criticise everybody else, we criticise the police, the government, the business world, but actually we see that in civil society the picture is pretty much the same. CIVICUS report in 3 years ago or so now told us that about 75% of staff working in civil society are women, but just 30%, less than 30% of the leaders of the largest NGOs are women. That's pretty much the same as the statistics in business and in parliaments. And nothing's really changed, I think, materially since then. As I said at the beginning, I worked at the time of that article at ActionAid, and I'd been part of efforts within that organisation to really tackle the lack of women in leadership. And with that, the ActionAid internationally had introduced a whole range of measures to increase recruitment, retention, advancement of women through loads of different measures, targets, women-only spaces, leadership programs. And I saw that was starting to have an impact, but also that it was having an impact on the way the organisation tackled much more seriously issues to do with women's rights across its programme and campaigning work. But those changes didn't happen overnight, and they did not happen without difficulties or resistance. So echoing the previous speaker, resistance happens also within so-called human rights organisations. I know from my wide networks here in Europe of women working in civil society just how difficult it is for women to succeed, even in our allegedly progressive organisations and societies. Macho work cultures prevail, long working hours making it very difficult for women and men to manage any kind of work-life balance. Women are facing continuous sexism as well as sexual harassment even within our organisations. Unconscious bias in recruitment and promotion systems continue to make it twice as hard for women to advance in leadership positions. And even, of course, harder for women of colour, disabled women, LGBT women. We see a lot of really very terrible power dynamics between, for example, African women working in Africa and white counterparts in the international structures. It's just unacceptable in our modern organisations. Has a huge negative impact on civil society, and I kind of set out a few examples of that. And just one of them is really just failing to have a representative kind of leadership, failing to draw in really the skills and talents that are readily available in our organisations. So the case for me is clear, and I want to link it to the issue of civil society space, if I may. For us, at a time where civil society space is closing down everywhere and our legitimacy is being challenged on all fronts, left, right, centre, top and down, it's essential for us to walk the talk in terms of our own rhetoric about power, rights, gender, social environmental transformation. So whether we're talking about climate change or tax justice, trade or land redistribution, all of those have a gender dimension that need to be understood, integrated and addressed. Certainly in Europe, one of the criticisms we face often is that we've actually become part of the system and that we no longer represent real alternatives or real people. So they're really challenging our legitimacy on that basis. If we as civil society are really committed to innovate and disrupt wider society for the better, we must be prepared to disrupt the power within our own organisations. It's simply unrepresentative and undemocratic to have so few women in leadership roles when women are half the population. If we're serious about transformational and systemic change, we need to support the diversity and different forms of leadership. We also need to recognise very deliberately the fact that women are at the centre of transformative change in their own homes and families, in their own workplaces and societies. And actually women have always been at the forefront of really radical change in social movements, from civil rights movement to anti-nuclear movements, but their role has typically been disappeared or made invisible. That has to stop if civil society really wants to play a role in changing the world. So in my article, I go into a bit more detail about some of that, and I also set out a few ideas for what concretely you can do about it, because if we really want to build a feminist leadership, doesn't happen necessarily overnight. So the first thing is to have a very deliberate kind of plan and approach towards transforming the leadership culture and bringing diversity. You need to have both the space, the resources and action. Those are the three sort of areas which need to be introduced by different civil society organisations. I'll just take you through, maybe if I've got a minute more, a few of the concrete ideas that I think you could do if you want to make some change today in the organisation where you work, but I set out more detail in my article. So the first thing is to make the issue visible, and you can do that by looking at the numbers in your own organisation or in your own networks. You can also do it by getting women together to talk about what some of the issues are that they're facing or they're confronted with. It's absolutely astonishing, I can assure you, in the different women in civil society networks I'm involved with, what starts to come out when you get women together. Second thing, you can take the pledge. That means that if you have an opportunity to go to speak at an international event or on a panel, make sure that actually a woman goes first, or a minority woman, ideally. Just make those spaces, or say that you will not go on panels where there aren't those people represented. I think it's about time that the men in power start refusing those spaces, occupying those spaces. You can create opportunities for networking, sponsorship, and mentoring, but these should not be about fixing the women to actually adapt to a basically defunct system. This should be about actually enabling a transformation in the leadership culture. I think women's networks have been one of the most powerful ways I've seen change really be brought about in different organisations. Understand and check your own privileges, so really go through an exercise in understanding power and privilege within your own organisation. For women in particular, a much better understanding of looking after yourself, so mutual support and self-care is really important, and it's a radical, actually, feminist idea that you have to look after yourself first if you can bring the change. Speaking out, absolutely zero tolerance on sexual harassment and sexism, with transparent policies implemented. And finally, I think civil society boards need to confront this issue as a political and strategic challenge, and it's really great to see CIVICUS board so full of fantastic and powerful women and feminists as well. And just to finish, I don't know if you're all following what's going on in the UK, but the latest news is that it seems to be likely that women are going to be stepping into leadership roles as the men are all resigning. So I thought it would be appropriate to introduce you to the concept of the glass cliff. You've probably all heard of the glass ceiling, and this article is about the glass pyramid, but the glass cliff is a term that's often used in business and describes a phenomenon of women in leadership roles, such as executives in the corporate world or women in political campaigns, being much more likely than men to be put in leadership roles during periods of extreme crisis or downturn, when the chances of failure are highest. And I think we're watching that happening live as we speak. So, and absolutely agree with Kene, the previous speaker, about the need for much more cross movement solidarity and unity at this time. Thank you.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Joanna, and thank you to all our four presenters. I think there was a lot of rich information there, and some, for me anyway, I was struck by the fact that you all talked in your own way about imbalances in power, within civil society, between civil society and other parts of society, power and resistance as we struggle to make our voice heard and to shape the world in the way that we see it. And I've also been struck in recent months around the world by those of us who want to, or those people who want to put civil society in the sort of charitable box, as if we're there simply to do good causes and not challenge power, whereas I think all of our speakers talked about different aspects of how civil society is at the coalface of challenging exclusion, marginalization, of promoting inclusion. And so thank you very much. I've got some questions that people have already posted. I thought we might begin with one which I quite like. How can citizens' voices who are not part of traditional civil society organizations be heard? And how can we in civil society, or in organized bits of civil society, contribute to that? I.e., how do we make sure that those voices which are marginalized are heard? Anyone want to have a go at that from our panel? You can just unmute yourself, Marie, Mandeep, or Joanna. I think Kene's left his hand first.
Yeah.
Joanna, go ahead.
Yep, so I wasn't sure who was going to be. That's a great question. And I think absolutely central to our legitimacy, but also our ability to innovate and bring real change. And, working inside the women's movement, it's been absolutely core philosophy of the women's movement is how do you actually mobilize and bring women themselves into the forefront of their own struggles and their own change, because the struggles we deal with are happening within the family, within the community, within the organizations we work in, and within the political systems and structures. So I think breaking down to all those different levels and understanding that the personal and the political are completely intertwined. So for us, this is absolutely central, and I think all too often organised civil society is drawn into a very technocratic role, particularly when lots of government funding is provided, but even citizens funding. So particularly the bigger organisations can become increasingly distanced from, if you like, ordinary citizens. So part of it's about being deliberate about it. Part of it's being about recognising that is one of our roles as social movements. And then the other part of it for me is to make sure that we are actually listening to those voices. It's not just like come into our world and now you accept everything we say, but it has to be about a dynamic relationship and a dialogue. And there's lots of ways in which that can be made to happen through physical kind of conversations and open space type discussions or online. But I think it's absolutely critical. And we've seen, you know, I think the political elites increasingly distanced from what real people are actually living, certainly in Europe at this time. And being able to reconnect that, and not only as an intermediary, but actually as a space creator. I think that's a really big challenge for us. Thank you.
Thank you. Mandeep or Marie, did you want to go on that question? Mandeep.
Thanks, Danny. You know, that is one of the questions that's been, consistently seen in our past State of Civil Society reports. In fact, many of the people who are engaging in civic matters are oftentimes bypassing organized civil society because our structures are too elitist, too slow to change, too much in conformity with regular ways of functioning and operating. So it's actually a very important reality for organized civil society to have to adapt to the different situations, and also to change according to, there's new ways of organizing that are happening, and we really need to be on top of all of this. But more importantly, I think reaching out to youth and also to the working class who often find themselves most disenfranchised by current models of democracy, which are so elite driven. But one thing I would like to emphasize is that organized civil society, with all its technical answers to problems, also has a very important role to play, particularly when there's been big mass movements that happen and which have led to change in the political system. But then there's a very important place for people to provide the answers to and work with the decision makers on putting in place the building blocks of a more responsive system of governance. So there's space for an insider approach, for an outsider approach, for an insider and outsider approach. But more importantly, I think in civil society, we really need to respect each other's roles and work in complementarity with each other. Thanks.
Thank you. Marie, did you want to answer that at all, or shall I move on to the next question?
Yeah, you can move on. I think we heard enough.
I've got a question here from someone in Ecuador who talked a bit about the worrying trends affecting civil society in Latin America, and she asks, how can civil society work across borders to protect their fundamental rights? And this is a question that goes to the heart of the CIVICUS agenda, because as Mandeep said, we're a global alliance, so we try to promote the solidarity across, and members of CIVICUS will know that we're about to head into our strategic planning process where we're asking this very question. So to the panelists, maybe Marie, we haven't heard from you yet. How are you at Peace Brigades International working across borders to build solidarity across civil society?
Oh, sorry, had to unmute. Well, at PBI, I mean, we are also a global organization, of course. I don't know if you heard about it, founded in Canada, and what we do is we provide protective accompaniment to human rights activists at risk. So yeah, we are basically, with that method also fostering cross-border solidarity, and then what we also try to do is foster exchange between the human rights defenders we accompany. So we organize meetings, and yeah, that's what we do at PBI. But of course, it is it is always a big challenge to bring together different groups, different languages, and then also in I think in context where organizations and groups, networks are so struggling so much with a very precarious, being stepped back from the daily and meet with others. That is, very organizations such as PBI try to organize exchange. We need to make sure that we do it in a way that people get compensated in a good way and can take a benefit. I mean, it's something that of course we all want, but then I think we also need to think through together jointly on how to do it. It's not, it's a process and not easy to do it in a way that it is really working out.
Okay, great. Thank you. Want to have a go at that?
Sorry, Danny, I didn't hear.
Okay, Mandeep, did you want to answer that at all?
Sure. I think we live in a time when there's such integrated problems that happen. So if there's a deficit in democracy in one country, or there's a economic policy or a social policy in one country which is extreme, it's going to have a cascading effect in other parts of the world too, and we're seeing that in neighboring countries more so. So it's really important for us actually to connect regionally, and because oftentimes these regional trends, both good and bad, can cascade and can affect. And there's also value in working together through regional organizations, because oftentimes regional organizations have common standards on many issues. So I would definitely say solidarity is our greatest weapon, and particularly, we work with lots of activists on the ground who work in very difficult situations, and sometimes, and then they oftentimes tell us that what keeps them going in, when they face a national atmosphere of vilification, stigmatization, all sorts of, slurs are put against them, but it's the solidarity of international civil society that keeps them going, keeps them inspired, and they continue to inspire us by their courage in the face of repression.
Thank you. Joanna, over to you. And just add another question. Someone's asked a bit about the intersectionality between feminism and LGBTI activism in Africa in particular. Maybe you could just dwell briefly on that as well when answering that question.
Great, thank you. I mean, for us, we're a regional organisation, European Women's Lobby, and we work necessarily across borders to try and influence our governments, but also to build a supportive space for civil society of women's organisations across Europe. And that supports in so many different ways, whether it's in the classic solidarity or just a voice of reason in a very difficult national context, but also as a kind of warning of what's coming. That's also been really helpful for us in Europe, sort of watching the trends as civil society space, particularly for women's organisations, has been closing and the funding has been closing. We've been able to build strategies together, strategies of resistance together. In terms of then our work together with the LGBT movements in Europe in particular, what we find is that those movements which seek to restrict LGBT rights classically also want to restrict women's sexual reproductive health and rights and women's rights more generally. So it's been absolutely central for us to work closely with colleagues in the LGBT movements in Europe, both to build stronger solidarity, stronger resistance, and also early warning signals. So we work through various alliances both at Brussels level, but also at national level, to really watch what's happening and then to also resist those changes that are coming. So to be more precise, when the Hungarian government starts clamping down or sending police into the women's organisations, they also at the same time going for the lesbian organisations and for the Roma organisations while I'm at it as well. So we have to come together in solidarity both at national level, but also to denounce that internationally. And then within our organisations, I talked about women in leadership, but I'm talking about the full diversity of leadership very clearly. Both the diversity of women in leadership, so the different women, different groups of women, but also really to support a different kind of leadership across civil society. That obviously includes also leadership from within LGBT communities. Thank you.
Great, thank you. I'm conscious we're 4 minutes past the hour, so we've run over a little bit, but this is, we did have a few interruptions because of technical problems, and so I wanted to have one more question, which I quite liked, which is around the fact that to participate in many of the international processes, policy-making processes, say at the United Nations, you need to have a fair amount of resources. You might need paid staff or institutions and the ability to travel to places like New York. I wonder if any of you have reflections on how we in civil society cross that divide between, especially sort of contributing to international policy change. How do we make sure that we have a level playing field for civil society? Just briefly, because I'm sure people will have other things to get on to. Who'd like to have a go?
I'll have a go. Absolutely, and having come from a large international development organisation and now working for the women's movement, I feel very sharply the lack of resources for us as women's organisations to participate in those big international processes. So on the one hand, there's like a huge demand for, which is a good thing, for women's organisations to participate in some of these processes. But that's completely at odds with the actual resources we have, both in terms of staff, but also in terms of our budgets for travel, for example. And so I think one of the things that the bigger international organisations can do is to think about who they invite and who they support to participate in those international processes. So can they sponsor a smaller women's organisation from their country or from their network to participate instead of them? I think that would be a very strong signal. When I talked about giving up your space and saying, am I really the best person qualified to go into that space? And if I can occupy that space, when will really the women who are representing from the Gambia able to participate in this process, for example? So I think it's really about the better resourced organisations really thinking in a much more challenging way about how they participate in those international processes. But you could also imagine some kind of solidarity fund at international level, for example. I read a very humorous, very funny article this week in The Guardian about what high level actually means, and the idea that high level panels actually just means old white men. And so we really need to start challenging that as civil society and saying we want different and more diverse voices around the table. It's certainly time for a different kind of leadership and a different kind of representation. Thank you.
Thanks, Mandeep.
Can I quickly add one comment? I totally agree with Joanna that that this reflection needs to be made and again by the well-resourced organizations. But we have also seen that at the same time, together, the civil society in the world, we need to work for these processes, the policy processes and civil society participation in these, to not end up being, these empty consultations, because we have also seen that too many times, that people from the global south have traveled to Geneva, New York, wherever, and participated, but then they feel that, it's really about, they are going there, they are heard, but then they don't know, if anything would be taken into account. There's no, statement on follow-up, what will happen with the input they made, and I think people, all of us end up being very, very tired of going through these empty consultations. So I think while, doing what Joanna says, and participation being real, effective, and resourced. Thank you.
Thanks. And Mandeep, over to you for a final word or any reflections on the webinar so far.
Sure. Thanks, Danny. I think, this is a very important issue because, and we addressed it in our 2014 State of Civil Society report. The big challenge is that a lot of the global governance institutions are based in New York or in London or in Geneva or in Paris or in Washington, D.C., and which by its very nature basically makes sure that lots of people cannot go there because of the involved. And even if you get somebody to come there, somebody like me who has to go through a discriminatory visa process knows how difficult it is. And I don't think just replacing how people look is just going to be the answer. Although I think that's a very important point that Joanna has raised, that we need to rotate the participation. But even if that has happened, we're still finding more and more elite participation. And I think the UN really needs to look into this too, and also see that there's a wide diversity of participation happening, of people and voices from the ground, of also expert voices who should also be part of that because they know the processes and they know how systems work. And we ourselves as civil society need to make efforts. And one of the things that we do through in our representation both in Geneva and New York is to get our members and partners to come there and speak for themselves rather than us trying to make them speak. But even in this danger of bringing people there, there's a whole there's a hierarchy, and I think that is what we really need to break down to achieve this holistic participation. But my final word would be, those global governance institutions don't need to be where they are. They need to move. The world has changed, and we as civil society need to be leading a forefront to get those global governance institutions to move closer to where, and to be in more diverse locations where people's struggles are.
Okay, thank you very much, Mandeep. Let me conclude that by thanking everyone for joining us. Kanya Puri, who asked about what are the benefits of the State of Society report to a CSO. If you're listening, I hope you were convinced by that conversation that this is indeed a useful contribution. If you liked what you heard just now, please do go on the website civicus.org and have a look at all of those various bits of this year's report. And please send us ideas for next year's theme, because we're still thinking about what exactly we should focus on in 2017. There's a lot more coming up from Civicus, especially around our strategic planning process for members, so that you can help us shape our next 5 years. And in the next couple of weeks, we'll also be launching, along with several other platforms, Action for Sustainable Development, which is supposed to be a mechanism by which civil society can organize and mobilize around sustainable development and address some of those power and resource imbalances that we've been talking about for the last hour. All of that, more information about all of that can be found on our website. So please go and have a look there. Thank you very much, and have a good rest of the day wherever you are.